After passing out my flight school, the first thing I did when I was out was trying out for the different driving academies to work as the instructor. I wasn't really into driving for airlines. I wanted to be a fighter pilot. But I somehow managed to not be in the National Air Force School, but instead, I was stuck with Commercial Airlines School. And as soon as I was out of the school, all I did was look for academies to train the new fighter pilot. I went to the school, and they told me that I cannot really join the academy until I have the in-flight experience. That means for that I had to join one of the airlines and get the flying experience. I did apply for all the airlines here, but none of them called back with my answers. So instead of waiting with nothing in hand, I decided to apply for the international airlines, as the domestics ones weren't really taking their time with the applications and I didn't have much time. I was getting impatient. I wasn't going to spend my year doing nothing after getting that license. So the first company that agreed to it, I took its offer. It was Vietjet Airlines. I was going to be a pilot for the Vietjet Airlines, and even though it isn't something that I had planned on doing, the gig was paying me really good, and by really good, I mean more than 6 figures, and I was pretty impressed by all the accommodations that came with it. And I decided that I might just do it for as long as I can, and gather a good retirement fund for myself. My first flight was pretty easy. It was all the way to India, and it was pretty basic stuff. And then come back, and I did. And as I did, it felt pretty great to be up in the air and using everything that I had learned in real life. And most importantly, the fact that people in the plane looked up to me while getting on the plane and while getting off the plane. It was a special feeling that I wasn't considering could change the way I was feeling about the job. I started out as the co-pilot to the senior pilot Alex Rios, and around in 6 months, I was given a route in command and began the pilot doing the frequent trips, and most probably the longest trips anyone ever did in the Vietjet Airlines. I was becoming a valued pilot, mostly because I was working towards the fighter license, and getting as much as experience was something that was making me work harder. One morning of June on a summer day, I was about to make a round trip from Vietnam to Russia, a non-stop flight and then getting back. The arrival to Russia was quite bumpy because of the terrible weather we just witnessed there, and getting to the airport was something that we had to get into with careful navigation. We were almost blind because of the snowstorm of the Russia, and we had to even announce that it will be a bumpy ride. And I could hear from the cockpit that there was a bit nuance in there. So I announced again, hoping everyone was seated. Wouldn't want anyone get injured on my watch. So after everyone was seated, I decided to carefully go in for the landing, and just a little delay. And the moment I landed safely on that ice strip and I had to announce that we had arrived, and it was a great feeling to see that the passengers were so glad that it safely landed, for when they looked out of the window, they couldn't see anything, and they really appreciated that we landed. And I could hear the sound of the applause, and it was a great feeling, and I was feeling it for the first time. And then, we didn't really have much time to spare before our arrival starts, so I just grabbed my cup of coffee while the crew looked over the plane, and then met with the technical guys who were telling that ours will be the last plane to depart from here. They were going to close the station for another month, as the snow was taking its toll on the airport, and it wasn't easy to take in more flights, so they were shutting it off. It was really weird to be the last flight, and to me, it felt like there was responsibility on my shoulder of some kind of it. So I had to make sure the flight goes in safe. So as everyone boarded the plane, I told them all to buckle up and informed them firsthand that it is going to be a bumpy and last ride from this airport. And since the weather isn't very good outside, everyone should get their seatbelts up and be really calm. And I started the takeoff, and slowly and smoothly, it went one without a bump. Since the takeoff was something that went smooth, I wasn't really worried about the rest of the journey. Around 2 hours in the journey, I could sense some disturbance taking place in the left engine of the plane, and that meant there could be heavy turbulence in there. And then I decided to go by the book, making sure that the plane remains stable in case we lose the left engine. And then I heard a faint sound. I know it is hard to believe that I heard a sound coming from outside of the plane, but I guess it was that or some intuition. I told everyone to hold on tight and get their seatbelts right. I knew the plane is going to be a bumpy ride, so I make sure it does not lead to something drastic. Everyone was buckled in, and the hostess were all set in, and we started, and I was manually keeping an eye on the left one. And then, just when I took my eye off, the right engine just exploded and started falling apart. I wasn't hoping that would happen, and people were freaking out. I knew that I didn't have the left for very long, and it will go down, so I had no option but to land the plane as soon as possible. If I didn't, the alternative would be even worse. And then I saw the fire building up on the right side, and I decided without caring much to drop the plane and land it. We were practically out of options and flying blind, so I had to make this tough decision. And we started our descent, and I announced, "It has been a great honor to fly with you guys. You people are brave and deserve all the applause. We are going to make a possible crash land. Please put on your life jackets," and as the oxygen mask dropped, I could hear there was a panic back there. We chopped the snowy winds as the heavy plane was setting and brushing through the forest. We were losing the plane, and by the time we stopped in the middle of the forest somewhere in Asia, I had a relief that at least it is not the people we lost. Every single passenger was unharmed in that crash, not even a scratch. We were stranded in a place we had no clue about and no idea on how to get out of that place. Well, that is a story for another time. Hey guys, thanks so much for all the support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so. 6 years ago, I flew over the Atlantic to South Africa for my first ever safari. I always had a fascination with Africa and the wildlife of the Serengeti, one that actually stems from being obsessed with The Lion King when I was a kid. I had that Elton John soundtrack on cassette tape too, and I used to annoy my mom by belting out The Circle of Life every time we drove anywhere. But over time, that love for Simba and friends evolved and matured, and soon, I was reading books on Maasai culture. It got to the point where I was fixated on the idea of traveling to Africa, and while my sorority sisters talked about visiting the beaches of Bali or the Bahamas after they graduated, my heart was set on the Serengeti. It took me years to be able to afford the flight, accommodation, and in-country transportation, but eventually, I had a good enough job and a pattern of bank account to be able to afford my dream trip to South Africa. And it was every bit as amazing as I imagined. I spent a whole week on various jeep safaris, hanging out by a 4x4 with a pair of binoculars. And let me tell you, even at a distance, just knowing you're looking at an actual lion is a serious adrenaline rush. On one of the safaris, a nice Canadian guy mentioned how incredible an experience it was, but lamented that he couldn't just get a little closer to some of the wildlife. Our guide reminded us that even at 200 meters away, some of the wildlife we were admiring could close the distance in just a matter of seconds. It was every bit as humbling as I expected, like I've never felt quite so vulnerable in all my life, even in the relative safe confines of the various jeeps I traveled in. But that feeling was nothing compared to what I felt when I decided to take a very different kind of safari. I first started properly considering an air safari after I landed in Johannesburg and began to see various commercials for them, and never really been interested until I spoke to someone on one of my jeep safaris that talked about air tours like they were God's gift to naturalize. According to her, air safaris were by far the best way to see the wildlife, and she'd go on an air safari every time if she could only afford it. Apparently, the animals don't react in quite the same way to the buzzing of an overhead aircraft as they do to a loud, clearly visible jeep. And she mentioned that the best way to get unfettered views of the animals acting completely natural there was with an air safari. That settled it for me. It didn't matter if I had taken a chunk out of my budget. I needed to get on that air safari to experience the same rush that she had. I ended up exchanging emails with a representative from one particular air safari company who promised me an extensive tour at a very reasonable price. A few $1,000s later, I was meeting up with a bush pilot on this little airstrip in the middle of nowhere and staring at the single-engine propeller plane that we'd be flying around the Serengeti. The battered old thing. Looked like it'd be like 20 or 30 years old. But the pilot assured me that she was the most reliable aircraft in their inventory and that she'd never failed him yet. I was a little apprehensive, but since he seemed so confident in the plane's ability, I saw no reason to disbelieve him. If he didn't think it was safe, surely he'd be the first person to refuse to fly it, right? So with that in mind, I climbed in the passenger side of the prop plane, and off we went in the skies above the Serengeti. At first, it was everything I'd hoped for and more. The plane flew low and slow enough for us to get some, frankly, incredible views of the animals. And I was amazed that they didn't react more than they did to some big metal bird in the sky buzzing over their heads. Only the younger animals near each herd seemed to pay any attention to us. All the while, moms continue to graze like, chill. We see these things all the time. Sometimes, we'd fly up just a little higher, then lean into a gentle turn that allowed us to circle any herd that I took an interest in, giving me a full-on bird's-eye view. I'll admit it was a little less personal than the Jeep safaris. He didn't quite get the same adrenaline hit. But little did I know, I was about to get a lifetime's worth of adrenaline. In just a few short minutes, about 20 minutes into the flight, we were circling over this herd of elephants with a steady droning of the plane's engine buzzing in our ears. Then suddenly, the buzzing stopped. It didn't just stop dead either. There was a stuttering start-stop rattling sound as the engine tried to keep itself going. But then, it just gave out altogether. I looked at the pilot completely baffled, but he waved away my concerns. Well, thumbing the plane's ignition, making out like it happens all the time and nothing was to worry about. I've stalled my car in traffic before, slightly embarrassing, but nothing to worry about. So I figured what we were going through was the aviation equivalent of just that. You rotating at best, scary at worst, but still, nothing to worry about, as I'm waiting for the engine to work back into life, and the pilot's repeated attempts to restart it. It dawns on me that this isn't some run-of-the-mill mechanical problem. The engine had died, and it wasn't coming back to life. And that horrifying fact became obvious once the pilot started trying to restart the engine. How I managed to avoid a complete mental breakdown, I don't know. But as the pilot turned to me and said, "We're going to have to land," I just heard, "We're going to crash." I remember wanting to ask him if we were going to die, but the words just wouldn't come out. I just stayed quiet as the pilot talked me through what we were about to do. "We're not going to crash, don't worry, but this is going to be a bumpy landing." Okay, again, I couldn't say it, but at the time, I was convinced it was the end. And when I realized that this weird feeling of calm came over me, this bizarre acceptance, and all of a sudden, I found I was completely calm. It was like there was no point worrying about something that I was doomed to face. We were going down, and there was absolutely nothing I could do about it other than brace for impact. The only thought I had left by the time we began to drop altitude was hoping that it would be quick and that we wouldn't burn to death before the vultures devoured whatever charred mess was left. At 200 feet, I was concentrating on my breathing, trying to keep calm as the trees and foliage below got bigger and bigger. At 100 feet, I began shaking, unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. I mean, think less nervous shaking and more terrified vibration. I turned to ask the pilot something, and I remembered him barking back, "Shut up and let me think." It was the kind of comment that would have me clapping back in any normal situation. But in a dead-engine prop plane over the African bush, I decided to just take it on the chin. At 50 feet, the pilot suddenly shouted, "Hold on." The nose tilted down slightly, and he began to bring us in for the emergency landing. I remembered just gripping onto this little handle in the cockpit, but I couldn't watch. So I decided to just shut my eyes and hope for the best. Then whammo, we hit the dirt hard. But instead of rolling over a crash, I could feel the landing gear of the plane rumbling against the earth. The plane was shaking like a leaf, and I was convinced it was about to just fall apart at any moment, but somehow it didn't. I heard the pilot shouting, "Come on, girl, come on, you can do it." As he talked to the plane then, out of nowhere, he just started whooping and hollering and celebrating. It didn't feel like we were safe, but the pilot knew that the worst was over and that we weren't going to just explode in a ball of flame. When we finally came to a complete stop, the pilot started laughing maniacally, kissing the dash of the plane and telling me, "I told you that she hadn't let me down yet." I was in just complete total shock, thinking, "Oh my Jesus Christ, I just survived a plane crash. I just survived the freaking plane crash." And that's when the euphoria hit. I'm still shaking, but I'm turning to the pilot, high-fiving him, telling him he's the man. It was the most intense feeling of my entire life, and one I'll never, ever forget. We were pretty banged up, but we were otherwise okay. It was nothing short of a miracle. But we weren't quite out of trouble yet. Once the euphoria died down, we realized we were stranded in the middle of the Serengeti. And our crash had attracted an awful lot of attention. No, most animals would have run a mile to get away from the big metal bird that came crashing down to Earth. But not all of them. Some were attracted to the chaos and the destruction, and it led to my closest encounter with any animal in all of Africa. We were quite easily able to relay our rough coordinates to the rescue team, and the pilot had a few flares that he could light and throw out on the ground if it got dark. So it's not like we were going to be stuck there for a frighteningly long length of time. But even the 90 minutes or so that we had to wait seemed like an eternity, because we were exposed to all of the wildlife the Serengeti had to throw at us. We got kind of lucky in the end, I think. But we still had a rather close encounter that frankly scared the life out of me. When you think of the scariest animals in Africa, you tend to think of lions, maybe hippos, definitely snakes and spiders. I doubt many people's first answer would be hyenas. But you can bet your butt that's my answer, after a pack of them wandered within just 50 feet to get a look at us. People say they laugh, right? Or the heel kick sound that they make is kind of like a person laughing. Let me tell you, once you hear that sound with your ears, it sounds nothing like laughter. It's terrifying. I remember jumping back into the cockpit of the crashed plane, like there are hyenas over there. The pilot was taking a freaking nap, but woke up to show me the pistol we kept in the same place as the flares. Let me know if they get close and I'll frighten them. Okay, try and relax. Try and relax. He tells me to try to relax with a gang of bang hyenas just a few feet away. If ever there was a clear sign that that bush pilot was completely insane, it was that. But I still owed him my life, so you can bet I didn't say squat to him. Not long after I heard the distinct sound of an engine in the distance and the plane's radio buzzed into life. It was the rescue team, having driven as fast as they could for almost 100 miles to reach us. Never been so happy to see another human being in my whole life. They drove us back to civilization and ate the single best meal of my life with a pilot at this little roadside diner. He asked for 2 orders of bunny chow, which turned out to be an entire loaf of bread stuffed with curry. And as it turned out, a bunny chow and several beers are exactly what a person needs after surviving a small-scale plane crash in the middle of Africa. When I was around 15, I lived alone in a 2-story house. Although there were bedrooms upstairs, I would sleep on the living room couch. This was for 2 reasons. 1, it was the central location of the house, so I could hear everything too. It was equidistant from every exit. One night, at around 2 in the morning, I heard someone juggling the front doorknob. It was slow, cautious jiggle, like they were trying not to be heard. When the door didn't open, they didn't stop. The jiggling slowly became less cautious and more irritated. They persisted for at least 2 minutes. We went to the back door, which was also locked. If I didn't want to call the police, because I was an unemancipated minor living alone. I didn't want to be placed into foster care, and I didn't want my parents in trouble for neglect. Eventually, the jiggling stopped. I stayed up that night waiting for them to try other entrances, but nothing happened. A few nights passed, and I awoke to the sound of the door opening upstairs. The doors in the house would really stick, so they took a lot of force to open. When he popped them loose, they'd make a loud scrape pop and shutter noise. At the time, I would take sleeping pills. It made it really hard to fully awaken, and I'd sometimes only awaken with sleep paralysis. I couldn't determine whether I dreamt the sound or whether I woken up from it. I started to fall back asleep and thought I heard the door close like grinding of wood rubbing together. Then the sound of bed springs screeching like weights were being shifted. I thought, maybe someone is homeless and they thought this was an abandoned house. I was super tired. I wasn't sure if I was actually conscious. I fell back asleep and awoke to the feeling of somebody watching me. There were stairs parallel to the living room door, and I could see them from the couch. Halfway down the stairwell, I could see a long-haired man, crouched over, looking at me. It was dark, and I felt like we were both trying to verify what we were seeing. I kept a metal baseball bat by the couch and grabbed it. Slowly, the man erected his body and without turning backed up the stairs. I just listened for him to leave or waited for him to come back down. But I heard neither. It was like he just stood at the top of the stairs waiting for me. I didn't go back to sleep. I heard nothing, even until sunrise. When I left for school that morning, that questioned what I'd actually experienced. I had my boyfriend over later that evening. As we approached the house, he said, "Hey, your windows are open." I looked in the room to the sticking door was wide open. I told him what I'd experienced the night before, and he helped me check out the house. After finding nothing, I enclosed and locked the windows. I figured it must have been a hobo. Once they realized somebody lived there, they left. I still stayed there that night, but I didn't take sleeping pills. I woke to the door opening again. This time, I knew it was real. They knew somebody lived there, but they still returned. At this time of my life, I had little value for my life. I had no fear of death because I knew where I'd go. I decided that I wasn't going to hide in my own house. I got my baseball bat, turned on the lights, and went upstairs. I yelled something like, "Listen, buddy, I'm coming up. Be out by the time I get there." I heard nothing and prepared for the worst. I checked the rooms and the closets, but I found nothing, and the windows were still open. I checked the downstairs and found nothing as well. I felt pretty silly after finding nothing, but still stayed out that night. I got ready for school the next morning and saw that the window was open again. It occurred to me that I hadn't checked under the beds when I'd done the search. I didn't have my bat with me and bailed. To think that intruder was possibly hiding under the bed as I searched the house is spooky, but I'm partially relieved that I hadn't checked. If I'd been down and come face to face with the man beneath my bed, the story may have ended differently.